Thank you very much. Actually, I'll just quickly make the correction as we did have a moderator change up this morning. In fact, it's actually going to be Alicia Dubois of CIBC, definitely in the business markets, correct? Also the Indigenous market? Yes, and co-chair of CIBC and also CCAB, and will be a part of our presentation as well. So I'll let her take the reins from here, so thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for interrupting probably very enjoyable conversations to join us after the break. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to wear my CCAB hat today because I'm actually replacing Max Goudreff, who's of course from the CCAB. Thanks, Randy, JP. So it's my pleasure to be here. What I'm going to do first, I'm going to just quickly introduce the panelists. And then I'll do a quick review of their bio with you. And then we're going to have a deck and a slideshow, and each of them will be sharing their thoughts with the audience today. So first things first, though, I want to thank Treaty 7 people for welcoming us on their traditional territory this morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and we appreciate the welcome and hospitality. So I'll first introduce Vicki Whitehead from Deloitte. She'll come up and take a seat. And then after her is Leith Cardinal, who just introduced me. Hi. Here, I think, come down and sit next to me. Yeah. And then Rachel Forbes after Leith. All right. Okay, so Vicki Whitehead is a director, Indigenous business in British Columbia. She's with Deloitte, and she is a practice lead for their Indigenous Trust segment. Vicki has worked exclusively with and for First Nations across Canada for 22 years. Her work at Deloitte focuses on First Nations financial management, trust creation and management, governance, and program creation. Vicki is Cree Métis, is the vice chair of the National Aboriginal Trust Officers Association. She's on the board of the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association of Canada, and on the AFOA BC Advisory Council also. Vicki completed her Master's of Business Administration in the spring of 2012. She holds a CPA, a CGA designation, and is a certified Aboriginal finance manager. The next to speak will be Leith Cardinal. Leith is the trust manager of the Anitsiskalpwin Business Trust. I've been practicing that this morning, so I was afraid I was going to butcher it. He's a member of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. Leith has managed the business trust for 10 years. Leith started participating as a trustee in 2007. Leith has been in the financial industry since 2001 and was recommended by the trustees to assume the role as the trust manager. Currently, Leith is participating in dual roles as trust manager and acting CEO of the newly created MECWAP Business Development Corp. With a diploma in management, Leith is currently working toward an MBA through the Cape Breton University. And lastly, we also have with us Rachel Forbes, who's the Coordinator, Reconciliation and Responsible Investment Initiative at SHARE. Rachel Forbes works with SHARE and its partners to build leadership among Indigenous trustees to shape models of investments that can support reconciliation and guide other investment trusts and non-Indigenous investors. Over the past 15 years, Rachel has accumulated diverse experience working on environmental, Aboriginal, and Indigenous legal issues, including national law reform campaigns, provincial policy changes, and specific nations' rights and consultation cases. She has a depth of experience in the nonprofit and charitable sector, particularly with respect to governance and strategic planning matters. Rachel holds a law degree focused on environment and Aboriginal issues from the University of Victoria and an honors BA from Simon Fraser University in Geography and Communications. Rachel is a settler, grew up with the on the Coast Salish territory, and currently lives and works in Vancouver, also known as the unceded lands of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueam nations. So I'll introduce Vicki to begin. Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia. Thanks so much for stepping up this morning. We really appreciate it. Great job. Good morning, everybody. As was mentioned, I'm Vicki Whitehead, and I work with First Nations in British Columbia and then in the Northwest Territories, helping them structure and manage their trusts. Before I kind of talked a little bit about trusts, I just wanted to know who in the room has a trust right now? Is there anyone that works on a trust right now? Or who has experience working with trusts? All right, so there's a few in the room. Great. So hopefully you've heard of NATOA. Leith and I will talk about it in a bit, but it's a great organization. It's a nonprofit that's there to help train trustees. Hopefully I pressed the right button. There we go. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about some trust structuring models and give you a few examples of trusts that I personally work with. For all trusts, basically what a trust is in a First Nations context is taking some funds that you have coming in, either from a settlement or from economic development, and taking them kind of out of, if you're not self-governing, you take it out of the Indian Act law and you put it in trust law. Every province or territory has separate trust law, but they're all fairly similar. So trust law has been around actually for longer than the Indian Act, and it's very specific. So as soon as you do, you have to follow those laws. So within each trust, what it does, it's basically a great vehicle for separating the funds in your audited financial statements. It can actually pull it out of your financial statements and be audited separately. Now, as an accountant, one of the other things the trust does is it deals with anti-money laundering. So for the companies in the room that are concerned about anti-money laundering issues and making sure that funds don't go directly into chief and council, then this is a way to help do that. So all these trust agreements then have to follow that trust law, but they can also follow First Nations culture and First Nation practices. So there's a way to kind of weave those two together. But in general, what's included in that trust is purposes. So that's what you can spend the money on. It's how the money is saved, because the point of setting up a trust usually is for it to be there for a long term. It's different again in each province, but in most of them, the trusts will be around for, can be around for up to 80 years. So the other thing it does, it's like how and when money is spent. So what are the triggers for that money to be spent, and what can it be spent on, and how much community engagement would be involved in that process. The other thing it does is who is involved in those decisions. So a trust has to have trustees, and there's two main models for trusts in Canada for First Nations. It's the corporate trust and the community trust. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of those as well. So when you're thinking about, or if you are thinking about setting up a trust, or if you're working with a nation that, and you're on the company side, and you want them to maybe think about setting up a trust, one of the things that we advise our clients is to balance your community decision-making with capacity building and protection of trust assets. And the ways that you can do that are, there's a number of ways on this kind of spectrum. But the more community decision-making and capacity building that you want would be the very far right. So on the left, where it's you have no decision-making, is the Ottawa Trust Funds. So if you're a First Nation, you have a capital account and a revenue account, it's managed by Indigenous Services Canada, and it earns probably less than inflation every year. And when you want to get the money out, you need to do a BCR, and in one case, you actually have to have a community vote. You really have no control over those funds. The next kind of line up, which actually is called a corporate trustee, which is the banks, and actually Alicia does those, and it's a great model. If you don't want to have any involvement, if you want to just have the money given to the bank, they'll invest it for you, they'll manage it, and Alicia can speak more to that, then that corporate model is great. And the bank will release the money to you once a year based on your returns on your investments. The next one over is the administrative trustee model, and that's the model that I work with the most. And that's where it's a First Nation community trust, and the trustees are community members. Now, in there, they differ quite broadly as well, and then the far left one is, I don't know, my right from my left, my husband will always say. Anyway, that one on the very end there is what Leith does, and he'll talk to you more about that. And that's where you actually have a trust manager that's from your own community. So in the administrative trust model, you have community members that are trustees. They're either elected or appointed, and they implement the trust, which is that legal document which is already structured. So they come on when that document is done and ready to go. And all they do is manage it per the terms and conditions of that trust. So if you were thinking about structuring a trust, you might wonder how long it would take. To me, the biggest part of doing that, if you have money that is coming in, is really the planning piece. So it's going through all those components in the trust agreement and deciding who's going to make the decisions on those, and even before you do that, what model you want. What's the one that's going to work best for you? And then the biggest piece can actually be community engagement. There's one community I worked with where we sat with Chief and Council, we made a bunch of decisions, we went to community, we did one round of engagement, then we got all that information, and then we went back and did another round of engagement. It's just because they really wanted to make sure their members were very much informed, because it was a big one-time settlement. So after that, we actually developed the trust, and we brought in a lawyer. So we had the framework pretty much done, and then we hand it to the lawyer to make it legal. And in there, like I said, we incorporated their culture and the pieces that they wanted and how they wanted their trust based on a lot of the feedback we got from community, but also from Chief and Council direction. In this case, we ratified the trust. You don't have to, so it just depends on what your direction is from community, or if it's a settlement. Sometimes if it's a settlement with Canada, they'll ask that you actually have it ratified, so that means you have the community members all vote on it. So then you start trust operations, you prepare the trustees and you get them trained, you enroll them in the NATOA training, and they're all ready to start with their trust operations. And then after that, you would hire your investment managers. So again, this is the model that I work with the most, which is the administrative trustee model. So in there as well, you would also hire an administrative trustee, or if you were doing a self-managed trust, you would hire your trust manager from your community. So we say that the full cycle actually can take a year. So really, ratification can be done within 6 months, but to get the whole cycle done and really up and running, it's a year. And actually, it can be longer, depending. So with some communities, we've taken a year and a half. So you may be wondering, how do we make those decisions? And it really is, I know this is a very simplistic diagram, but it is weighing what your future needs are with today's needs. And which trumps? Because of course, how much money you save will help with your income that you generate every year after this, but then maybe you need something big now for your community that you really need to spend right away. So these are the discussions that we have at the beginning of the trust, because you don't want to be having those at the end, because by that point you've already talked to community. So it's really good to have those decided ahead of time, and those purposes. What are those purposes? So this is an example of a community that we work with. It's a fairly complex trust. They have treaty land entitlement, they have money in GICs, they have impact benefit agreements, and then they have a specific claim settlement. And they've decided that all of those are going to go into this one big trust, and it's managed by community trustees with us as their administrative trustee. And when the money comes in, it goes into 3 buckets right away. So the first bucket is the flow-through funds. So if you have impact benefit agreements with companies, they generally have requirements in them that maybe you need to have a committee where you jointly meet, or maybe you need to spend some money on a specific purpose. So you need to get that done right away. So the trust can't hold those monies, they have to go out right away. So the band can implement those pieces. The second part is community benefits. And then they have some which is actually for distribution, but that's really for short-term and medium-term needs. And so they have 70% of their money going into that community trust after the money's gone out for the flow-through funds. And then the last piece is the Heritage Fund, and that's 30%, and it's saved for the long term. In this specific trust agreement, they're setting that aside for 15 years. And then they're going to decide through a community referendum how it will be spent. So this one includes community engagement on an annual basis, and the trustees are all community members, and they're trained on trust management and work with an administrative trustee. On this trust, it's funds from an impact benefit agreement again that come into the trust agreement, also a community managed trust. And again, that flow through funds right away goes out to the band so that they have the money to implement all those requirements from the impact benefit agreements. And then they have an economic development fund. So this community has a big project that's coming through their community that they've agreed that's going to happen, but a lot of money is going to be coming in over a period of 5 years while this business is going on. So they actually are setting aside $10 million for economic development. And that can be accessed through very specific terms and conditions in the trust agreement, and it's actually a revolving loan. So it can only be paid out and then paid back. So that's how they've structured this one. So that's how they're using their trust to leverage economic development. And then again, they have a legacy fund and member benefits. So you can see the complexities, they can be quite complex. But one of the best parts of it is actually engaging the community members and having them sit as trustees, because they have actually quite a bit of learning that happens when they do that. And we've seen a lot of trustees actually go on and even further their education from the ones that we work with. I also have one that I'm not showing here where we have 2 advisors that sit on the trust, and they're actually from the companies that the money is coming from. So let's say, for example, it was a pipeline and 2 of the companies were concerned and they just want to see what's happening with that money. So they sit as advisors and they just tell the trustees how much money is coming each year, and they're there to hear about how the trust operates, but they don't vote and they're not involved in it. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Leith.
Thank you, Vicki. Good job and good introduction to the type of discussion that we would have. NATOA is the National Aboriginal Trust Officers Association. I myself am the chair of that organization, and Vicki is the vice chair of that organization, so you have quite the tandem here today to talk about that particular item. And NATOA, of course, is based on a simple process of wanting to educate community members across the nation in trust and investment. One of the simplest things that we have is financial literacy is a big challenge amongst most community members. So this is kind of one of those access points, a focal point where if your community is looking to talk about a trust, or at least in the area that there may be a windfall of some sort, you may want to actually have this conversation, because it does change the idea of how we're going to plan for future activities of our communities. So again, it's still something that is still very critical. We do have a phase 1 introductory program, and we are about to launch phase 2 this spring at our upcoming conference in May, which is being held in Vancouver. So there's our plug. Definitely, I look forward to seeing some new sponsors, new members, and definitely great to share the information that is absolutely critical from a foundational grassroots organization. As we are founded from members of the community that is simply asked the question, where can I find information that would help me in trust and investment? And that happened back in 2006 by one of our founding members, Alana from Garden River First Nation out in Ontario. So again, thank you very much for the NATOA piece, but definitely it's something that we need to talk more about. So again, I'm the chairman, Vicky's the vice chair if you want to know more. From here, I think I want to just get a little bit more onto the personal level of what we do with the Untitled Business Trust. I am the trust manager and have been involved with the trust since 2007. One of the simplest things that we've been able to do is attract very good members to be trustees of our community. We've had finance people, 30 years of finance. We've had former chiefs act as trustees. We've had entrepreneurs act as trustees. And the most exciting thing about this conversation is that we are all members of the Satellite Cree Nation. We are all beneficiaries to the Untitled Business Trust. So it's not always a fun history either, because there's always been the challenges. We are a business trust. Some of our biggest assets have always been owning the businesses directly. So this being a partnership conversation as well, I think it would be quite important for me to delve into that type of conversation. I want to give you some excerpts here from the early days of our conversation, and that was signed off by our leadership and by partners in the community. Corporate and community interests recognize the merits of cooperation in developing capacity building relationships with Aboriginal communities. Coalition members will pursue that enabling process in order to build enduring relationships and cultivate increased participation of Aboriginal people through opportunities related to the oil and gas industry. Past and current efforts, industry initiatives, Aboriginal communities, and different levels of government are recognized as positive contributions toward capacity building and Aboriginal communities. 2 seconds. With the coalition members recognize the mutual and sustainable benefits of Aboriginal equity partnership in a drilling rig, and equally recognize the groundbreaking nature of such ownership and eventual Aboriginal ownership. These are all pretty impressive words considering the type of conversation we had, and this goes back 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago, when it all started to begin. To work with a First Nation, you really do have to find a good relationship with who you're working with. This conversation was basically 10 years in the making. Our early partnership started with a gentleman by the name of Elson McDougald, Western Lakota way back when, and also an Andy Popko with Encana at the time. And this was a very bold strategy, considering that we were not in a place to have this type of conversation yet, but somebody put it on the table, and it turned out to be a very wonderful step forward, because there was a model that was built for success. Elson McDougald, again, he created this wonderful partnership. I have to be mindful, there are probably other partners in the community, because there was, if I'm not mistaken, there were 11 partners in total, kind of up and down a little bit there with a few extra partners. But what we look for in this particular model is we've entered this into generating wealth for our community, looking for employment opportunities for our community. And it was very mutual in that discussion that we were able to at least go forward and have this. We bought our first drilling rig back in 2003 under this partnership, so 50-50. Consider that as a very important part. We had this really good conversation, and 50-50 in a partnership is absolutely important. I think it was a great start. 2003, we got our first drilling rig. By 2005, we were on our second purchase of a drilling rig. And we started with Western Lakota. Soon we got bought out by Savannah Energy, just a number of years later. And with that conversation came a change of ownership. This experience was wonderful in some ways, because Savannah did their part to try to make sure that initially they didn't come in with all intentions to be the best partner either, but it didn't take long before they realized the value of these Indigenous partnerships. It didn't take long at all, but otherwise at the same time, we began to realize the value of this partnership. So up until recent years, we found that of all the partnerships that Savannah was working with and had done a great job with, there was $53 million distributed amongst the communities. And this is 11 partnerships, keep in mind. And about 12 or so drilling rigs. It was quite an incredible scenario. This is all very good. Like, this is the feel-good story behind this. And Savannah put together a wonderful training program. But in some areas that was lacking. I mean, finally I got to the point where I'm like, all right, Savannah, let's step up our game. Not all our people want to be rig hands. We should start training managers and office admin staffs and all the other participating roles of an organization such as yours. And about, say, A year and a half ago, there was a lot of rumblings about takeover Savannah by an organization called Total Energy. Now, this is where things kind of changed a little bit, and this is kind of the experience that we have to work towards, is understanding it. Total stepped in, they took over Savannah in a hostile takeover situation. It was perfect. Another learning scenario for us, and a great experience for Total as well in some ways, because I think when we put it all back together, this is where our relationship didn't meet mutually as it originally intended. One of the first actions, like I said, I do apologize. They may not be here to defend themselves, but I wouldn't talk like this if it wasn't this experience that we were given. The first course of action is that we have value of $5 million in our drilling rigs. And the first course of action Total gives us is, yep, you're only worth $1 million. Here, we're decreasing your book value. Oh, well, here's the contractual relationship. This is how we're going to get out of this partnership. So based on the book value, here you go. This is what we can offer you. So in a two-step format, don't get me wrong, they were playing within the lines. But this was not a very mutual relationship where we actually had a fair advantage, because all of a sudden, we went from $5 million to $1 million, and they're offered to be magically $1 million as well, when we knew our value was worth so much more. So in recent time, we are actually dissolving this organization because we couldn't find any common ground with Total, which is unfortunate. Don't get me wrong, they're playing a game of we are still a good organization to invest in, but in the back of my mind, this was a terrible experience, because here I am, a Treaty 6 Indian, and I feel like this is our Treaty 6 scenario all over again. Here's a wonderful agreement that for your people to benefit off of, but yet get so little from this discussion. So I have to be very mindful and open about that type of conversation, because it doesn't make sense to me how we can be so productive in the millions of dollars of return for what is only going to be thousands. The opportunity for employment. Oh, we're a great place to work for. But we actually had ownership of these organizations. And now that all has to go away. So again, this is kind of if you're going to be involved with Indigenous business, approach it in the open mind that you can actually hold true to the values that you are entering with that organization or with that Indigenous community. Because at times, I can honestly tell you, we don't really have much. And when you ask for too much, or you're trying to give too much and take it all away at the same time, that just might be poor business practice, or it might be just business to you, but you know what? This is a livelihood for us. We're just trying to gain some traction in business. We're trying to get ahead, we're trying to catch up, we're trying to do our best for our community members. So that gives you an idea of what we deal with in our business relationships. Now, it has to be just in my opinion primarily, because I work for the Untitled Business Trust. This is not directly related to the community itself. Chief and Counsel would have a different opinion on this matter. They'd have a different approach on this matter. The Untitled Business Trust, as its own entity, does things very differently. And we have to talk about it in a different fashion, but for us, it's return on investment, it's wealth creation, it's long-term income for my community, as well as creating employment. So over and above, we get into this scenario of, well, the trust, we have to keep doing things. We do have another partnership with NCSG, Crane and Heavy Haul. And as you can imagine, that's Crane and Heavy Haul. I mean, it's pretty simple. Andy Popko was the one that brought that to the table as well, and I already mentioned his name earlier when it came to the drilling rigs. So I think when it comes down to it, some of these individuals, like an Andy Popko, do come with some good intentions in all this discussion. So keep that in mind when you do approach a First Nation, is that you do have to be probably patient, because again, you're not just going to get in right away. I think some of the worst scenarios that have ever arose is when he said yes right away and we didn't necessarily know to what. So just keeping that in mind. And also, as we begin to discuss business, we recently opened up an entity that is wholly owned by the trust. Again, our business trust can own organizations at private levels as well as the open market for shares in the publicly traded companies. But for us, we're going to take this step forward, a new journey, if you will, that is completely in our control and completely in our ability to do it on our own. And this is based on the lessons that we've been given to us over the past 15 years, or at least with my experience, I've been able to say, you know what, I think we have to just do this on our own, because we're having trouble gaining traction in some of these conversations. And for whatever reason, I'm not going to say, but it's hard to suggest that our partnerships are hard to work with at times. So, and I don't know why they are, but the Mi'kmaq Business Development Corporation is our new entity where we will happily go out there, and I will happily have those conversations with partnerships if you are so willing. Because again, we do have a little bit of money to work with to help, capitalize going forward, but not a lot. So if one of your approaches to a community is that First Nations have millions of dollars to work with, your first impression might be wrong as well. Because even if we think about the funding programs as well, I mean, those are all dictated by the federal government, and they're very, very strict. I mean, we can't go outside those lines, otherwise they start to hold back funding, which is not exactly correct. Then we have impact benefit agreements that take a long time to organize, and they're not just overnight decisions as well. And then we have other settlements that take a long process as well, and probably need to be more thought out of from the community level than it is for somebody else to say, hey, I got an idea for you, why don't we do this? Because these are very short-term solutions sometimes to, hey, let's try this. But why the community members need to learn and understand some of the businesses that they enter into just for the benefit for the long term. So again, it might be a little bit more of an honest statement that I put here on the table today, but at the same time, it's an experience that I'm happy that we went through, but also not happy that we went through, because believe me, if it were still us today, we'd still have a different arrangement with our partners and still doing more for our community members, because that is primarily my focus. Once again, I think it was mentioned this morning that we have high poverty, and I'm one of those people. We have the poorest people in this country. Well, definitely eliminating poverty is going to be one of my biggest efforts going forward, and by creating employment, at least we can try to make traction in that discussion as well. So the Untitled Business Trust, like I said, First Nations partnerships, they are very useful. They are a great tool to grow business in every angle possible. But again, your approach may be just as important, and your absolute understanding of the First Nations position is absolutely critical as well. So again, I do support your discussions going forward. So by all means, if you have any questions on such experiences, that'd be fantastic. But thank you very much for your time today. I think it's a wonderful experience and great to see so many industry people out there. To me, it's not always about oil and gas. I think there's plenty of other opportunities in other industries as well that you'd be just as useful for. Because again, I'm not just saying rig hands are the way to go, but definitely anywhere that we can grow capacities in management levels and other experiences and trades and what have you, they're all going to be very important, and you will all be very useful for our people. So thank you very much for your time.
Now we'll call up Rachel from Share.
Thanks very much. So to put this in context a bit, you've heard from Vicki talking about how you can structure trusts to align with values of community and better match the appropriate economic development interests of those communities. You heard from Leith about his business trust and some of the partnership experience he's had and the benefits for community and the challenges for his community in exercising that. I'm bringing the perspective mostly of investors and institutional investors, both Indigenous trusts as investors themselves and non-Indigenous institutional investors such as universities, pension funds, foundations, and religious investors. That's the clientele primarily of SHARE, the Shareholder Association for Research and Education. And we're a national nonprofit who works on responsible investment services, policies and practices, and policy reform on a either provincial or national level. We've been around for about 20 years doing that, and overall our goal is to move capital into a more productive, sustainable, and inclusive economy. And our work has involved Indigenous rights and human rights for quite some time, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a quick run through the background of what brought us to working in this space, and in particular with our partnership with NATOA, which is called the Reconciliation Responsible Investment Initiative, and that's where I am housed in that partnership. So I think most people in the room should be familiar with. If you're not, please get familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report and then 94 calls to action that it issued. Call to action 92 is to the business community, and it kind of gave SHARE a stronger framework to be approaching the business community and the companies that we work with on behalf of shareholders to push them to recognize Indigenous rights and relationships with Indigenous communities, opportunities for advancement, employment, contracting, procurement with Indigenous-owned companies, and to reflect on their own business practices and whether or not they were providing educational opportunities to their employees, to their board, who do they have on their board, who's involved in decision-making, that kind of thing. So those are the questions that we work with. We use this call to action 92 as a framework to talk to publicly traded companies primarily, but increasingly some other privately owned enterprises about their commitments to working with Indigenous peoples or lack thereof, and how it's actually going. We started that work with a report that came out probably 2 years ago now on business and reconciliation, and we looked at 173 publicly traded companies on the TSX, evaluated them in 8 different sectors. So this isn't just resource, this is telecommunications, healthcare, kind of across the board, and looked at what kinds of track record they had in terms of what they were reporting on Indigenous employment, representation and board of directors or other advisory level, what kind of practices they had at their companies in terms of employment and advancement. And you can see, if you can read on that graphic, some of the dismal figures there of 1%, 3%, companies not disclosing on this type of reporting yet. And that's part of the challenge, is that it's not, where we have fairly standardized reporting around female representation on boards and labor practices and things like that. We're still lagging in the space of other types of diversity on boards, including Indigenous peoples, employment practices, contracting practices, and that kind of thing. So this was one of our kind of, again, foundational documents of what does it look like out there, what are companies doing, and how can we help move things along in that way. So we do engagement with these companies on behalf of the institutional investors that we represent. And this past year, we engaged with 14 companies specifically in Canada around issues around reconciliation. I've seen quite a lot of movement from some of them and some commitments to increasing numbers, and we do keep checking back in on that. The ones that we don't, so you'll see 8 companies out of the 14 actually committed to improve practices and improve disclosure around those practices. The ones that are not in those 8, we are actually looking to additional campaigns and reasons why there isn't movement in those sectors or at those companies. And within that framework, I just want to give kind of a shout out to CCAB's Progressive Aboriginal Relations Program. When we work with companies and we work with institutional investors, if the investors, asking, how do we actually know a company is doing what they're saying they're doing? How do we know they really have good relationships with different Indigenous communities? And CCAB's PAR program actually provides a really good tool and measurement for that, for companies, not just publicly traded ones, private ones, and they are additionally modifying this program to structure better for small and medium-sized enterprises as well. And they have an independent auditing function and an Indigenous advisory panel as well that also helps capture things that aren't captured well in a checklist, because as I'm sure everybody is aware, relationships of any type, and including with Indigenous communities, aren't always just best covered by checking boxes on a checklist. A lot of it is relationships, and the ability to capture the genuineness of that is difficult, and I think CCAB's POWER program is one of the accreditation almost programs that has a way of building that in. So that's one of the reasons we refer to it. All of that to say, so we work with these institutional investors, which include Indigenous trusts, and we have formed this now partnership called the Reconciliation Responsible Investment Initiative with NATOA to work with those non-Indigenous investors and also to work with Indigenous trusts to help align capital better with Indigenous values, both at a, and I say that plurally with intention. There are many different values, and it changes from community to community. So we don't intend to generalize across Canada or across North America or across the world. And we do work with Indigenous communities in different jurisdictions too. So there are many different things that come up that are nuanced, that are careful to be, we're careful to how we incorporate that. But we do believe that we can work with these Indigenous trusts to better align capital with those community values, and some of that's, in the things that Vicki alluded to around structuring the trust agreement from the beginning in a way that really aligns with your community's both short-term needs and long-term needs and the sustainability of that and the values of your community members, what you want to use your capital for in terms of outputs into the community, but also where you want to invest that and how you can, know what you're investing in and whether or not you feel like your money is actually working well for you on that end as well. And I just want to reference a couple of our publications and work on this. One of our founding documents in this program was written by NATOA board and president member Mark Sylvester and Jason Campbell, and they've got a discussion paper, which I've got a couple copies of if anybody's interested in, on responsible investment for Indigenous trusts and the different types of principles and questions that can be asked if you are working with a trust that is considering these types of things, or if you are at a company that a trust might be investing in and you want to actually do some proactive measures of having a better relationship with some of your shareholders. So that's just, in the interest of time, I will just scoot through those primary principles, and I will end with this lovely quote of Mark Sylvester of NATOA about Indigenous trusts and how they are increasingly leveraging their investments in companies throughout Canada to ensure that they really benefit the different communities that they're involved in and the long-term sustainability of our communities.
So yes, thank you to each of the panelists. I also work in Indigenous trusts. I'm just going to add a little bit from a leveraging perspective, because some of the most interesting work that I get to see from my professional standpoint is when communities are in a position to make the most of their trust investments and that allows them freedom to then engage in very smart own source revenue generation. There's many ways that communities can leverage their trusts. They can have it actually part of the trust deed, so built into the trust agreement, or they can permit themselves through bylaws, financial bylaws, to be able to use the revenues for the purposes of debt servicing, for borrowing. And what's interesting is that as we talk about like a business trust versus a community trust, there are differences when you're talking about leveraging. So a business trust would be, as a lender, would be viewed as a diversified entity, whereas a community trust, so a trust where it's either through community trustees or through a corporate trustee, and that has more the government, more the nation governance structure standing behind it, that leveraging as borrower is viewed more so as a government. And there's different, and those are two different classifications. And those different classifications are really key because it impacts sometimes. It's a bit different when you're leveraging trust revenues, but if we're looking at economic development borrowing versus government borrowing, it's a different risk rating because economic development borrowing is diversified borrowing, whereas government borrowing is more like public sector. It's more like HUMs, so hospitals, universities, municipalities, schools. And because the primary source often of income for governments is other forms of government funding, so whether that's provincial government funding or federal government funding, the risk rating is lower, and that means your interest rates are lower. So there's a lot of very interesting conversations to have when you're starting to look at developing your trust agreement, and whether that's through a community trust structure or whether it's through a corporate trust structure. If you're looking to leverage your trust in order to drive economic development, understanding the way the banks view you, and not all of us view you the same way, understanding the way we view you will help you drive your initiatives and help you keep money in your pocket, which is really important. So like education is key. We've heard that all morning. and that's something that I think everybody that's on the stage is really focused on, education being the key. So that's from my unique standpoint with respect to this conversation. And I'm happy to chat about that and for it to be like no strings attached, just a chat. So I'm gonna go to questions. Do we have time for questions? How are we doing? I know we're bumping up against lunch, but I also know everybody just ate. Yeah, we're good? Okay, so we'll take a couple questions. So for trust panel, do you account for the returns to community via jobs and infrastructure that is built on reserve? Returns seem to only focus on dollars or percentage of return.
Yeah, I can answer that. So there's a couple of trusts that I work with, and the purpose is they have built a community hall, a band office, and they're actually looking to build, they built a shop. So it's really how you set up those purposes to begin with to make sure that you can do all the things that you want to do. But there is an annual report that we do every year that speaks to the longevity of the trust and making sure that they're meeting the investment requirements of the trust. Hi. It's my friend. Yeah. And then there's also there's also in the annual return how many members have received support from the trust. So we actually go through each of the programs that the trust provides. So one of the things that we make sure in our trust planning at the beginning of the year is that the funding that's going to go to the First Nation for programs isn't already funded from another area, because you don't want to double up, like Lee said, or replace somebody else's money. So when the money goes out, the members know that it's from trust, and the program has to be structured properly with a policy procedures application. And then we get the information back, and it comes into Deloitte, and we release the money because we actually sign the checks for that trust, and we track how many members receive support. So I'm sure anybody spending any time in communities will know that the biggest needs are usually those that are the most at risk, which are the children and the elders. So those are two of the big programs that we see. We also see a lot for medical, and actually post-secondary is huge. That's really great. But we still want to make sure that the pressure is put on the federal government to meet their responsibilities, because, I mean, why should the trust have to pay for all of this? So by tracking these, they can actually go back to the federal government and say, hey, you know, you guys aren't supporting us, and here's the actual need because we are spending on it. So it's not just about what goes back out to the community, it's what goes out to your negotiators, to your funders, so that you know, your community can be stronger for it. So it's a great question. Thank you.
Did you want to add something, Rachel?
Maybe just a tiny bit, that in terms of infrastructure, there's also the potential for a trust to invest directly in infrastructure as an alternative type of investment. So different trusts are exploring those types of things, and there are increasingly a number of different vehicles that investors can choose to invest either directly in an infrastructure project or in larger infrastructure funds, such as the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association is building this infrastructure fund now, and that will be open to investors to see those results directly in Indigenous communities.
Yeah, and I certainly see it too. So again, going back to leveraging to drive business and revenues, there's a couple of different types of organizations that are born out of that. There are organizations like corporations whose mandate is to generate revenue, and there are other more social purpose businesses that are constituted that are really there to drive employment opportunities. And so, like, you know, these companies have to be well run, they break even, but their purpose is very socially driven. It's much more about capacity building, education, employment opportunities, but they're still very, very viable, and they're extraordinarily important to the strength of a community. So I see both also. I think that's it for questions, unless anybody has any others and you're a bit of a non-techie Luddite like me, and you'd sooner just raise your hand than the old school way. Okay.
I have a question for Leith, actually. I just thought his story was really interesting. And I was just wondering if you could have done anything different with the company that you're having that issue with, what would it be? Based on what you know now.
Well, that's a terrific question. The part of the problem that we get to is based with the contractual obligations are what are hard to break because you work around them in so many different ways. Like I said, Total, they played within the lines of the game and kind of changed the perspective for their benefit and not ours. So keep in mind that that's not always the practice that we had experienced because when Savannah took over, their first game was to challenge it, but after understanding it, we actually benefited even more because we put the real value on that table. So it becomes down to the reiteration of the benefits and what we're actually trying to do for our communities. And if you're the institution that's trying to work with a community and you avoid that situation, well, you're just repeating the histories that have been a problem for many of our communities to begin with. So it makes it very hard for me to say, well, you're a great institution when you've treated us. Yes, we were small, but you've treated us very differently than you would anybody else. So it's still the approach. All we can do is take on the positive aspects that were presented. Like I said, in my community alone, we were about $12 million for our community, and all of a sudden, the offer is, less than $100,000 on the value. It didn't make any sense. So again, it is about the mutual respect between the organizations, and as mutually as we tried to approach it, they definitely took the advantage away from us, or at least the mutuality away from it. So again, just another process. Be fair, honestly.
Okay, so I think we are up for time, but thank you so much to the panelists.